Hey guys, so this is going to be our last week of content because I want to give you guys the last week to work on that bigger project, that overall project, final project that has all the different subjects, that cookbook. So we are going to finish everything off by talking about some East Asia culture, and I specifically chose the samurai and Japanese anime manga because I feel like you guys would be the most interested in that information. So let's go ahead and get started with the Japanese samurai and learning about them. So way back in the day, in the thousands, emperors were ruling Japan for hundreds and hundreds of years. But at some point, they actually started to lose authority, and instead of the emperors being the main people in charge, you instead had land owning lords. So if you can think of medieval times, this is medieval times just in Japan rather than like in Germany and France. So you have these land owning lords, and they belong to really, really wealthy families, and they started expanding their territory and they grew really powerful. And to protect their territory and their power and that power, they formed these private armies, and they ended up hiring these warriors who are known as samurai to protect their estates. So you have these foot soldiers in the armies, and then you have more specially trained people, and those were the samurais. They were trained specifically in the sword, the bow staff, those types of martial arts. And so the word samurai, it actually means one who serves, and the relationship between the lord and the samurai, it's part of something called the Japanese feudal system. It's very similar to what came up in Europe during the Middle Ages. And what happens essentially in a feudal system is you have a landowning lord, somebody who owns the land and is wealthy, and you have the warriors. And for Japan, it was the samurai. And in medieval culture in Europe, it would be the knights. So in Japan, you have the samurai. And then below them, you have the peasants, the people who are working the land. They may live in a little town on the land. And you kind of have those three different levels. And those peasants, you would sometimes call them serfs, Serfs. You guys will learn more about that in world history, but more on the European side, less on the Japanese side, like we're talking today. And much like the knights of the Middle Ages in Europe, they focused on a code of behavior. And the code valued honor and bravery and loyalty. Part of the code for Europe is actually chivalry, and so they're very similar codes. So they weren't just skilled warriors, but the samurai actually also focused on the arts and their creative side and developing that. And that's where you get a lot of the difference. So it's not just about being a warrior and being able to fight and being loyal and brave, but developing your creative side and creating poetry and these ink paintings. This influenced not just their culture, but the overall Japanese culture. Um, the samurai values of loyalty and that hard work and their interest in those arts, they ended up influencing Japanese society to what we know today, where they love their art and their literature. They're more focused on the technological side, but it's almost an art form to them as well. And so then we move on to the Shogun period. All right, so you have these powerful families and they're battling each other for control. And then in 1192, there was one lord from a powerful family, the Minamoto family, and he ended up receiving this title of a shogun, or a military ruler, from the emperor. So you're not just like a normal ruler or lord, you're specifically a military ruler. And the shoguns, they held the real power in Japan. Minamoto ended up establishing a dynasty, and you guys know a dynasty. It's a series of rulers in the same family. We learned about that in ancient Egypt, and they actually ruled Japan until the 1300s. So after the Minamoto family lost their power, rival families started to fight for control, and what you end up getting is Japan in a lot of different wars between each other in its own territory. So there's a big period of disorder. They're not a united people. They're not united together. Instead, they're fighting one another, like America during the Civil War. So then in 1603, there was one shogun, and his name was Tokugawa Iwasawa. Sorry, I'm bad at pronouncing those names. He ended up defeating all of those rivals, and he united Japan. He ended up moving the capital from Kyoto to Edo, and that is actually where present-day Tokyo is now. So he moved the capital to Tokyo, essentially. And that family of shoguns, they ended up restoring peace and uniting all of them together. They also isolated themselves from the rest of the world, so they weren't trading a whole lot with outside people. Instead, they kept to their own state and they worried about their own people. And we know trade is a huge influence on globalization and developing culture, interacting with the world. And when they ended up actually reinstating themselves into the world, they did so with war. They ended up invading Russia and China and taking in more of those lands before they actually fought with Germany later on in the mid 1900s, 1940s, in World War II. And that isolation period ended when the Japanese people, they persuaded their shogun, their military ruler, to resign, because that was the shogun's decision. They wanted them to remain isolated. So in 1868 that happened, and you end up getting imperial rule. You start getting an emperor, that one person being in charge. And that emperor put an end to samurais. So 1868, military rule stops happening. Samurais, not really a thing that exists anymore. There's definitely still that code and that honor, and they impacted the culture so much, and influenced even modern movies today and modern artwork and all that type of stuff. However, there have been no official samurais since 1868 because they put an end to that period of time. And so those words to know, we got samurai, feudal system, shogun, and dynasty. And then I have a nice picture here to show you guys what samurais actually looked like. Pretty similar to probably drawings you've seen or what you've seen in movies. Big difference, they don't necessarily have their full face covered. In a lot of movies they'll do that. And you can see they usually use a bow staff, they'll use different archery tools, and they will also use the sword. And so next lesson we're going to talk about Japanese anime, so I will see you guys there. Bye!